family is that my mother also came from the area. They, if anybody knows where Duck Creek Ranch is, that was my mom's property. So my dad and Eddie, they still did some stuff together, so they decided to go to Detroit and to get my dad a blue Buick. And he just, you know, loved the big new cars, so they went back to Detroit, and 2 kids, and he was a ranch kid, and he drove his blue Buick back to the ranch, and so it was parked out in front of the house one day, and he looks over and there's this lady, and she's riding a white horse down the road, and she is dragging a badger that she wrote. Yeah. So he said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Well, I didn't think about it, and I wrote this badger, and I can't get rid of it." So they're visiting, and in the meantime, the badger, he makes a beeline under this blue Buick and starts fighting around, and it wraps the rope around the front bumper of the Buick, and they're only bolted on back in those days by a couple of bolts, so it ripped the front bumper and anyway, that turned out to be my mom. And so our ranch is pretty much a typical modern ranch. We had cattle, and my dad would calve out in the winter, and of course snow was the hardest thing, and you know, you could have a 3-day blizzard, and they did like the old stories where they would put a line out, and my dad would have to follow the line to the haystack and throw some hay over, and then follow the line back to the house and all. But one thing that he did is he built his own ski plane, and he was a welder, and he fastened this kind of a cage contraption together, and put it on these big wide runners, and then he ordered, I think you could order them through Sears and Roebuck, but a reverse prop. And so in an airplane they go one way, in a ski plane they just push along the ground, so they're you know, just turned around, and so that became the winter mode of travel. And you know, it was, so safety today is like paramount, but safety back then, it was like not high on your list of priorities, because you had to get back and forth. So my dad would, you know, like fire up the prop of the ski plane, and he had a toggle switch up there, and he says, "Now remember, if something happens, you just put that switch down." And I'd say, "Well, Dad, what can happen?" And he says, "You'll know it if you see So he fires up this prop, and there's a couple of you know, runners, and they get all iced down. So he's outside of the ski plane with this prop with nothing around it behind him, and he's like rocking the ski plane to break the ice off of the runners. And then when we started to go, he would just like hop up and get in it, and we'd head off. And so we spent time like going into the Centennial Valley and all over up there in the winter. It was like amazing and stuff. And then he was kind of always a renegade, so one time when we ran out of hay, he decided that he found some, so he went with a Caterpillar in our sleigh, and he decided it was shorter to come back across Henry's Lake. So he made it completely back across, but he was about 20 feet off of shore, and he could hear like ice cracking, and he tried to go faster, but it all kind of ended up in the lake. I don't know how he got it out, but anyway, that was one of his adventures. So there at Henry's Lake, we didn't have power and or wells or phone till really late, like, probably 70s or something back in there is when they finally brought the power in. And one thing that, I kind of feel is important about our ranch and everybody's ranches is the, like how you interact with the wildlife. And we've had, we always have stuff going on our ranch and stuff, but two things that were unusual were one winter an elk started to come there, and he would go on to the cattle feed ground, but he decided he wanted all of the hay, and so he would just chase the cattle off, and with his horns he was like bunting them. And so my dad called the Fish and Game, and they devised a plan, and they came out and they sawed his horns off, and then he could just eat, fine and stuff. So he came back the next year, and when the Fish and Game showed up, the elk ran, and he laid down in the creek, and he put his horns up over his back and tried to hide but it didn't work, and finally he didn't show up one year. And then another thing that happened was is that we had a buffalo that moved in one year, and he lived with our cows for a while, and that kind of sounds romantic, but he would be like with the cows, and then he would decide that he wanted to eat like across the road, and so he would just like walk through the fence and eat for a little while, and then he decided he'd go back with the cows, so he'd walk back through. He wouldn't go through the old hole, he had to make a new hole, and he'd go back in there and stuff, and then he got kind of like pushy or something, and he'd get on the road, and my aunt had a brand new Cadillac, and so we were driving with my cousin, and the buffalo scratched down the side of the brand new Cadillac, and so and then he came in the yard, and he tossed the yard gates, and we had to always look outside to figure out where the buffalo was at that time. So anyway, today we don't have our own cattle anymore. We take pasture cattle. We have a rotation system on our ranch that's working really well, and we're kind of proud of the fact that you can work with all of the agencies up here now, and we've done a lot of creek restoration. We have some great riparian areas, and they're important to our, to Henry's Lake and to the fishing and things like that. So we're trying to stay connected with the animals, and it's fun to see like a bear walk down to the willows and hang out for a while and stuff like that. So that's kind of where we're at today. We also have a few head of sheep, and I train stock dogs on it because you have to be able to diversify and make money, in different areas. And so, what the connection with the land is, it's incredible, and you can't, you can be having a really bad day, and you get up and make yourself go out, and it might just be fencing or something, but you look around and you smell everything and you hear everything, and and it changes your life, and it changes your life every single day. And so, it's really, we're really grateful to be here, and we're hoping that we're good stewards of the land, and that Island Park will stay what it has been.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think we're going to stand on this, and we're going to talk about Tom's Creek. And
we're fine. There we go. Please go ahead, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, Tom's Creek is a patch of ground that's just east of the Pond Lodge Ranger Station, and it's an inholding actually because it's surrounded by state and federal land. So it's a little tough to expand from that. But I want to start the story a little earlier than that because it's quite different than what we've heard here because we don't live up here. My granddad homesteaded in Ashton and his brother in 1901, and we've expanded from that, and so my granddad was J.A. actually, and one of his sons was Preston, which was my dad. So I'm third generation down there. I was never going to be a farmer at all, but one day my brother left the farm and gone back to the University of Iowa to get an MBA, and so Dad was complaining about that he couldn't get help, and so I said, okay, I'll come back. I was at the university working that summer at the university farm, and so we were out checking moisture for the crop out there, and I picked up a handful of dirt, and it was warm and it was wet, and I just looked at it and I said, this is me, this is what's running through my veins. Then my next thought was, oh crap, I'm going to be a farmer. And so I was, and so I have been. And so we've been increasing the size of the farm as opportunity prevails. But I want to drop back for a minute on how we wound up here, because Tom's Creek, my dad bought in 1957 in March, and I was 12 years old at the time. And I was sleeping in the basement of our house in Ashton. Well, actually, we're 5 miles east of Ashton. That's where the homesteads are. And they sent me to bed a little early, and I went, what's going on? And they said, no, you stay on the basement. And so pretty soon some people come in, and they were talking up there on the kitchen table. Well, being a teenager, well, I was quite a teenager then, I couldn't stand that, so I was at the bottom of the stairs listening to what was going on. Well, it turned out that one of the neighbors, who was a farmer, rancher, had been caught taking hay. He didn't run on the short hay, so he stayed hay out of the neighbor's stack at about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And that wasn't the first time he had been caught doing this, and he wasn't too excited about seeing the judge the next day. And so he was peddling this ground that he owned to my dad, and my dad was one of the few people at that time that needed the range land because he had almost none, and he was able to write a check to buy it. And so at that night in March, he bought the ground we now own up here in Island Park at Tom's Creek, and it's a 320, and also came with it was 150 state land, and then we also had 160 down just north of Ashton. You come pretty close to driving by, but with that also come around 1,000 acres of BLM ground, and we've expanded from that. But anyway, we first progressed to build a jack fence. So this ground was very overgrazed. I think they've been using a little Forest Service ground with the additional grazing, and so we spent 2 years building a jack fence around the state land that came with it and our deeded ground. And that was interesting because my mother never did want me to go up there because Dad had apparently cleaned out one of the bars from the help he was using, and she said, oh, you're going to learn some bad words up there. That's okay with me. I did. She was right. I did learn some bad words. But they built the jack fence, and then it took them 2 years, and by that time, by the range being overgrazed, and it was pretty good, and they started putting cattle up here. But it also became obvious, this is very good grass up here, incidentally. That's why there's cattle here. The best gains that we have in our cattle herd is up here. And so they come up, we graze it off, and then just before we go to dig potatoes down there, then we take them down north of Ashton. And our big range now is the fall range, which, well, one of them I should say. The Ashton Reservoir is our south boundary. And so we don't have to do a lot of fencing because they don't like to swim in that reservoir. It's a pretty reservoir. And so that's where we spend a lot of time. But with this place come 2 cabins. One of them looked like it had been built in a rather large hurry because it was just barely a roof, slightly better than a tent. But there were big chinks in the logs that they hadn't spent much time hewing anything. And then That was probably built, best I can guess, because nobody really has ever known when that cabin was built, but it must have been right after the turn of the century. And then a cabin next to it was built, and they did put some workmanship into that, and it still stands. The other one, when we got the ground in 57, already the bottom log was pretty well rotted out, and the second log was on its way. And the roof was a disaster, but when we built the fence, one of the guys would go over there and sleep at night, which he must have liked mosquitoes, because boy, that was not mosquito proof at all. So, this property, Tom's Creek, I don't know how many people have heard of Tom's Creek, but Tom's Creek, half of it comes up on the Forest Service, comes down about a little over a quarter mile, and then it joins the other half, which comes up on our property, and we're about a quarter mile from where the junction is. And then it goes down the north side of the property, and then under the railroad bed, and goes down there far enough, pretty soon you get Clemens property, and then you have the ranger station. And the road going into there was something to behold, because it was very crooked and a lot of potholes, and much later then they built the Chick Creek Road, which you now have to go up, not take you clear up on top of the mountain there. And so that's the one we use, but this property of Tom's Creek is very flat. And it was real interesting in what they had done, because they had to dig ditches to flood irrigate it, and then they had to dig ditches to get rid of the snow water, because in the spring it would turn into a lake out there, and so they wanted to drain it, and then later they had to come and irrigate it. But while Dad and I was fixing a gate one time, a couple come in, and they must have been in their pretty close 60s at that time. And it turned out that they had rented that ground in the Depression, and they had run between 6 and 12 milk cows all the time, I should say all the time, for about 2 years in the Depression, and maybe even longer, and they were milking these cows all winter. I can't think of a worse thing to do to yourself. But they would milk cows, and they had these tubs. I mean, you've seen them, they're kind of galvanized tubs, and then milk a tub full. They could sit outside, it'd freeze, they'd dump the ice out, go back in, fill it up again. And I'm sure it was getting 50 below many nights. And I can't imagine hand milking cows when it's like that. They just fall. They were surviving, they weren't living. And what they would do, as soon as the snow set up, then they'd take a team of horses and load it up with these blocks of milk and haul it to Pond's Lodge. And they said they were getting $1 a block. And they were furnishing milk during the Depression clear to West Yellowstone. And what a way to live. Well, they didn't do that too long. I can tell you, I can't imagine even doing it for a couple of years. But they had actually gone out, and the hay they fed the cows was this grass hay they were cutting out in the meadow. It's not very good grass. I mean, you don't milk a cow, you're not going to get much milk out of this grass hay, I can tell you that. They must have been importing something else to go with that, because those cows had dried up, I think, on that grass hay that they were trying to cut. But that's how they did it. And the geology of this place is quite different than most of what you're going to see in Highland Park. We discovered that the hard way, because we decided to cross fence the meadow out there, and we'd go in and dig post hole in the spring of the year, water would come out the top of the hole. What you had was about 8 inches of soft and a foot or so of hard pan, which is a bentonite sand mixture, and then it was pure sand. And under that, we'd have to be out there with one of these augers, you go, and then go into that sand, boy, you had to be fast, because it just boom, like that. And then you had heck of a time getting pulled back up out of the sand. But the water would run out of the top of the hole in the spring of the year, and it's really, really difficult to tamp a post into that when water's trying to push the sand right back out that you're trying to pound into it. But that's how we did it. But we had that spring comes up, it runs a constant amount of water, as does what comes up on the Forest Service, and it's exactly 50 degrees, so it never freezes. And I guess in the old days, they also said when they were starting out hay, same deal, they turned the horses loose out in the creek. And if they had to, they'd do some of the livestock as well, and that's how they wintered. But the snow, we've got a corral out there at the top. Pole is probably about this high, easily 6 feet. and we'd go in there snow machines, and we do that every winter. We used to have to go in and shovel snow, but I put a new roof on that in the cabin. But you just see a bump of snow where that top hole was. I mean, that snow gets deep up in that area. And it left a little bit to be desired. But you can never get very cocky around there because we would bring the railroad, we'd put our cows and calves on the railroad and bring them up to the railroad, the same siding that the railroad used. I don't remember the sidings I remember going by was Eccles and then Trude, but I think it was Eccles is where the big railroad trail is, and it's still there. And we still use that. But anyway, we'd unload the cows, and then by fall, the calves would be big enough that we would literally trail them back down to the Ashton Reservoir. And we had our last cattle drive several years ago, and for a good reason. We'd come along and start trailing them down that. And by that time, Last Chance was getting plugged up in houses, so we could hardly get the cattle through there. We had people out there shaking their brooms at us and yelling because the cows would get out on their lawn. And that wasn't too cool. We used to overnight them in the gravel pit, where just below the Henry's Fork crosses the highway there. And then anybody tells you that you can use your saddle for a pillow, they are telling you tales. We tried that, and you smell worse than the horse when you get there by morning. Besides that, you don't sleep much. And the cows would be out daybreak and grazing, and then you had to round them up, and away you go. Well, we came down, got to about the Ashton Hill, and it was a hot day, and the cows were thirsty. And it was one of those falls that was dry, and there was no mud puddles. So we come over the Ashton Hill, and they got a whiff of the reservoir down there. And away they went. We had a stampede. And we hadn't had that before. And we had an old retired Maine potato grower down there that was supposed to turn them. There's a junction in the trail there, and he was supposed to turn them down one canyon. And they come charging at him, and he turned around, and he ran. So some of the cows had been there before. They took off to where they were supposed to go, and the rest of them went after him. And he dove off into the brush finally, and the cows thundered by him. Well, and instead of a 2-day cow drive, we wound up spending 2 weeks, and we still didn't get them all until snow come. And finally brought them down into the farm ground. And we flew it even trying to find all those dang cows. And so that was our last cattle drive. From now on, we load them on semis, they go up on semis, they come back on semis. But the railroad ranch, when Ben Nisi was a manager, as I remember when I was I wasn't even high school, I was grade school then. And the last time I remember bringing a bunch of cattle in here, the railroad always furnished a special train for the railroad ranch whenever they brought cattle in. They brought 800 head of heifers in that one time, and they had something like 8 riders that they brought them from that corral into the railroad ranch. And I don't know how they got that there. Those must have been some mighty tired horses when they got there, because there's only one thing dumber than one heifer, and that's 2 heifers. I will vouch for that. But we've been real lucky. We've expanded our cattle herd. We've actually started moving a lot of our operations south, and because we don't like to feed hay in the winter, and that's a problem with Ashton. I was raising cattle, and I can make any money out of year in, year out. It's just a way to get rid of your hay and market it. And so here I have 2 daughters, and one daughter married a cowboy out of Baker, Oregon. And so we have the 4th generation now, and he is really into cows and does an excellent job. And he has more bulls than we ever used to have cows. It's, I think they're somewhere in the 1,000 to 1,200 head now. It depends on the day. But I have our 5th generation kids right here. Carter and Katie. They spend more time on a horse than I ever did too. So thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Clint. He brought up about questions, and I think we're going to hit on that in just